Last week I told the story of seeing my son sitting at the computer, playing a video game, clicking the mouse, and each time he did, he was shooting zombies. And only to find that each time he killed one of these zombies, another one just popped up to take its place. He was locked in this relentless war of attrition against these soulless, mindless creatures. And as I watched, I was overcome by a strange sense of familiarity. And I only later realized it's because I spend hours every day on my computer clicking the mouse, deleting mindless emails, and just as fast as I can delete one, more come popping up onto the screen. And whether it's emails or Facebook posts or tweets or texts, like zombies, they're relentless. They just keep popping up one after the next. And if we don't watch out, they can take over our lives. For those who've missed it, I also explained last Sunday that it is said that the monsters in a society reflect the fears and the anxieties of that society. For example, Frankenstein was popular at a time when people feared the results of untethered and unregulated science. Godzilla emerged when people were anxious about nuclear war and atomic energy. Vampires, which are said to reflect our concerns about disease, made a cultural comeback at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And today, zombies are the monster du jour in our culture, and it's because people worry about our lives being taken over by soulless technology and mindless materialism. The question for us today is, what saves us from becoming one of the walking dead? The zombie fixation across America is not so much about our fear of death as it is about our growing anxiety about the lives we are living. None of us want to live soulless, mindless lives that are like living deaths. Does anyone know where the concept of the zombie originates from? It turns out that it did not originate as a character from B-rate horror films. They come from a combination of old African religious beliefs mixed with French Catholicism called voodoo in pre-independence Haiti. Zombies were a product of the world's most merciless and cold-blooded examples of slavery. The zombie was part of the New World's voodoo mythology and represented what would happen to a slave if he or she committed suicide to escape the terrors of being chattel under French rule. Journalist Amy Willens explains in an essay in the New York Times a few years ago that death was readily desired by many slaves of that era and region as the only means of escape. Only something worse than death could inspire people living daily through deadening cruelty to endure such circumstances. What was worse than death? Becoming one of the walking dead. For the slave under French rule in Haiti in the 17th and 18th centuries, the only escape from the sugar plantation was death, which was seen as a return to Africa, or Guinea, literally Guinea or West Africa. The plantation meant a life of servitude. Guinea meant freedom. Death was both feared but also wished for. Not surprisingly, suicide was a frequent recourse of slaves. But Willens explains that according to the voodoo religion, suicide would render one's soul unable to make the passage back to Guinea. So a person became a lifeless zombie. If slaves tried to escape their desperation through suicide, they believed that they would become a zombie and therefore would remain half alive, yet forever estranged from Mother Africa and possibly under another's control, so no better than a slave eternally. This idea of clinging to life, no matter how desperate, as an alternative to a living death, gave many slaves the inspiration to persist through what was a living hell. It gave them the will to live. If you have a Haitian heritage, you may be alive today because of that belief, which helped people survive slavery so that one day you could live. In spiritual terms, it is said that death brings with it new life. It happens in video games too, if you've noticed. As I watched my son's video game, occasionally zombies would get the better of him and kill him first, and when that happened, he'd die, but then his character would come back to life. I used to think that video games were teaching our children the wrong ideas. I thought they were sending the message that death is not permanent. But now I realize that they may be teaching our children the most important lesson of life. It's worth saying that when I was my son's age, we used to go to the arcade to play video games. We didn't have computers in our homes. And I can remember when the games would end, they began to give the player 30 seconds to add 2 more quarters, and then you could continue playing and get 3 more lives. If you had enough quarters, you could theoretically go on playing forever. It reminded me of the old Catholic indulgences of the 16th century, when if a person had enough money, they could buy their way into eternal life. The sale of indulgences was clearly corrupt, and it eventually was stopped, but it reminds us that all the money in the world cannot buy a new life after death. And that's good news, because it's available to everyone equally who have ears to hear and eyes to see. Here's what I mean when I say death leads to new life. Everyone experiences many small deaths while we're still alive. Losses, disappointments, dashed dreams, broken relationships. And how we deal with these smaller deaths has a direct correlation to how we will deal with our final death at the end of our lives. Just this Friday night at our Soulful Sundown service, All Souls member John Jacobs told the very touching and emotional story of the death of his first wife, Joyce. He describes a conversation that he had with the hospice nurse standing on his front porch who was helping him to understand why Joyce was so strong and patient and thoughtful during the final weeks of her life. The nurse said, "It's not surprising. I see it all the time. People die how they live." That's to say, how we respond to the smaller deaths and disappointments while we're alive is inextricably tied to the way that we will confront our own death someday. Now, as I talk about death, I know there are many people in this church, like myself, who are interested and influenced by Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion. In Hinduism and in Buddhism, there is the idea of reincarnation. Now, this is an idea that we have many lives. You sometimes hear people talk about wanting to be reincarnated as Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie in their next life. Or people talk about hoping that their boss is reincarnated as a fungus, which is technically more likely to happen from a scientific sense. But the Hindu teacher Ram Dass gave a different explanation. In the later years of his life, he had a stroke and he was paralyzed in one whole half of his body. And after that happened, he wrote an article about this, which was aptly titled "The Sound of One Hand Clapping." In it, he explained how he had lived many incarnations in this life. He described his childhood in a Jewish American family as one incarnation. He told of his years as a renowned professor at Harvard as another. And then he became a part of the 60s counterculture and a spiritual seeker. And eventually, he became a Hindu spiritual teacher known all over the world. He explained in this article, which he dictated because he could no longer write, he said that he was now entering his next incarnation. This time, it was the life of a person who is severely physically challenged. At each stage, he said he had to let go of what was in order to embrace what is. And this, my dear friends, is the simple and challenging secret to the fullness of life. Our ability to die and be reborn again and again in this life. A person who is single and then gets married has to die to being single in order to successfully live into this new stage of life called marriage. The person who has become a parent has to let go of his or her expectations of who their child is supposed to be so that they can embrace who their child really is. You ever see parents who have this idea of their son's going to be a great athlete or a great doctor or something, and they never are able to actually nurture that child into being who that child is meant to be in the world, which is our role as parents, because they are so frustrated because they have an idea already that needs to die about who their child is supposed to be. The person who is divorced must face the death of that part of their life so that they can embrace and live into the next. If we cannot learn to let what is dead be dead and let something new arise, then we can become like the walking dead ourselves. It's just like cells in our bodies, such as skin cells. They die over and over so that new cells can replace them. Do you know what we call cells that don't know how and when to die and just keep on living? Cancer. That's right. There's a parallel in our spiritual lives. We need to know how and when to let parts of ourselves die spiritually. The poet Goethe says, "Whoever has not experienced what it means to die and to become, to die and to be recreated in dying, is, in his words, but a sorry vagrant on this dark earth of ours." In other words, death creates life. This is not just spiritual wisdom. Science says the same thing. The stars had to die so that life on earth could begin. Plants and seeds must die so that new life can be born. It's the essence of Easter. And as Reverend Fred Craddock liked to remind his congregation each year, Easter does not last only one Sunday. It lasts for 40 days until the Ascension. So since this is technically still Easter, let me say a few words about what the Easter story tells us about this move from how death can lead us to new life. Some people over-identify Easter with nature and the seasons. And I understand that. Nature gives us wonderful, beautiful, glorious metaphors for death and rebirth. I even used many images from nature in my message last Sunday. But as wonderful as the return of spring is to celebrate after a long, cold winter, as Reverend Peter Fleck says, there is no newness in it. There's no newness in it. The spring annually repeats itself. This spring is as last spring was, and next spring will be. Leaves fall from the trees each autumn, and trees return with buds and blooms each year. It is a predictable cycle. But Paul says in the Bible, the old has passed away, behold, the new has come. The Easter celebration, that the new has come, is the very antithesis of the spring festival. At Easter, we do not celebrate the beginning of another cycle in the endless routine of the changing seasons, but the breaking of the routine, the opening up of a new dimension. Easter is the celebration of the truth that there is a newness that can break the vicious cycle. Newness that enables us to overcome death with life, hatred with love, division with wholeness. It says a couple who have failed each other again and again are not doomed to failure. A community that has become divided is not doomed to be haunted forever by the events of the past. The old can pass away, the new may come. Out of the death of the old, the new arises, says theologian Paul Tillich. Die and become, says Goethe. Easy for them to say, but it's hard to do. We all have known adults who are adult in body and in stature and in time, but who are really children in so many ways. Some of these need therapy but refuse to go. They are afraid to lose their identity. They are afraid to die to what was. And so they remain stuck, unable to embrace what is. Addicts and alcoholics pour poison into their bodies to kill something that is wanting to die. A memory that haunts them, a trauma that torments them, a grief that will not let them go. But the poison, instead of killing the problem, often kills the person and their entire life. And even if someone who is addicted remains alive, they're like the walking dead. Anyone who will forgo their family, their career, the endless opportunities for love in this world just so that they can keep pouring more poison into their bodies is not living. But instead of being the kind of death that brings on new life, it's a soulless, walking death, a living death. It is to become a zombie. But even the addict, as we have seen time and time again, can be resurrected into new life, a new life of sobriety and hope and possibility. There are so many small deaths that we encounter through the course of our lives. Leaving home is a kind of death. We have to let it go to embrace what's new for our lives. Reaching midlife, that's a big one. Do a whole sermon on that. Letting go of unfulfilled hopes, it's a kind of death. Navigating, of course, the death of a loved one. How do we find new life after someone that meant the world to us is gone? The end of a career. A death requires new life and brings new life to those who are open to it, or the death of a relationship. When I was in junior high, I learned a very powerful lesson about death and renewal. There was a woman at my church who contracted Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. And as soon as the diagnosis was confirmed, her husband of 13 years took off. He ran away. I'll never forget the sorrow on the woman's face as members of our church took turns pushing her in her wheelchair into the service every Sunday. The sorrow we all felt was so much bigger than the unfortunate and impending death of this once beautiful and vibrant woman. The ghost of her husband's failure to live up to his covenant of marriage was always circling around her, or at least around the minds of those of us who saw her. And as sad as it all was, there was always the question in the back of everybody's mind saying, could I do it? Would I be strong enough to watch and assist the person I love die a slow and debilitating death? And I suspected then, that everyone's internal yes, I could and I would, was always tinged with just a little self-doubt and self-recrimination. It was as if his action was almost a kind of indictment of us all, putting before us the possibility of our own failure. And then about 8 months or a year later, the husband returned. He returned to face his deeply disappointed and dying, but gracious and merciful wife. And he returned to face the inevitable judgments and ultimate embrace of his church community. Even at 13, I remember that along with his return came a feeling as if a foreboding cloud was lifted off of our church. Not only did his wife have her husband back, but we all could take a sigh of relief, imagining that the potential hero within each of us was still a possibility. And an even bigger relief to know that even if we did the unthinkable, our community would not banish us or scorn us, but would welcome us back. Like the prodigal son. He was lost, and then he was found. He was dead, and he came back to life. How did he do it? Was it prayer? Was it friends? Was it therapy? We don't know. I was too young to ask. But somehow, at some point, he realized that he could not keep running from what is and try to hold on to some idea of what was. His wife was going to die, and he was going to live. But this life was a living that was worse than death. His running. It was a soulless life. One of the most often misunderstood passages of the Bible says, "For whosoever will save his life shall lose it." For whosoever shall save his life, meaning whosoever will cling to his old identity, shall lose it. Jesus goes on, "And whosoever will lose his life for my sake," that is, for the sake of my cause, the sake of death and resurrection and the renewal of life, shall find it. In order to find our lives, we must understand what it means to die and be reborn again and again and again. And if we are willing to let go of what was and embrace what is, we can experience the beauty and the mystery of resurrection, our own. What saves us? Our ability to die and be reborn in this life. You may think this is all just some religious jargon, but it's really a matter of life and death. Yours. Amen.